Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into the bizarre, inspiring, and honestly, ultimately tragic life of history's absolute greatest self-made speaker. We're talking about a man whose words echoed so loudly across the ancient world that they literally outlived the empire that crushed him. Let's get right into it. So, I've got a weird question for you. Would you shave half your head and speak with a mouthful of pebbles just to win an argument? Sounds totally absurd, right? But this perfectly highlights the extreme, almost unbelievable lengths that a physically disadvantaged orphan from ancient Greece went to just to achieve greatness. This is the incredible story of Demosthenes. To understand this guy, we have to go back to Athens in 384 BC. Demosthenes was actually born into money. His dad was a wealthy weapons maker. But tragedy struck early. His father died when Demosthenes was just 7, leaving him a really sizable inheritance. Well, the guardians entrusted with that wealth, they completely embezzled it, every penny they could get their hands on. So what does a young Demosthenes do? The moment he comes of legal age at 20, his very first public action is to sue those corrupt guardians. He actually won. And even though he only recovered a tiny fraction of his estate, the crazy thing is, in the process of fighting for his birthright in court, he accidentally taught himself how to be a public speaker. Now, the sheer madness of his self-construction is it's fascinating. You see, Demosthenes was not a natural speaker, not at all. To build his style, he put in an immense amount of effort. I mean, legend has it he transcribed the history of Thucydides 8 times by hand. He literally built an underground study just so he could constantly exercise his voice without being interrupted. He would lock himself away down there for 2, maybe 3 months at a time. And here's the best part. He'd shave exactly one half of his head so that, out of pure embarrassment, he wouldn't even be tempted to leave the house. And he had real physical hurdles to overcome too, a notoriously weak voice, shortness of breath, and a pretty noticeable stutter. But he was relentless. He meticulously constructed his abilities, literally syllable by syllable, through some bizarre but highly effective methods. To fix that stutter, he practiced speaking with a mouth completely full of pebbles. To strengthen his lungs and fix the shortness of breath, he would run up steep hills while reciting long, complicated passages. And to train himself not to flinch at distractions, he practiced intensely right in front of a mirror. Talk about the ultimate self-made man. Section 2. The Threat of Macedon. So, in the late 350s BC, Demosthenes shifts from being a legal advocate to stepping into the massive arena of political oratory. And this happens right as his ultimate nemesis enters the stage. The contrast here is wild. Up in the north, you have Philip of Macedon, who basically took a backward kingdom and turned it into this incredibly disciplined war machine, famous for their terrifyingly long sarissa pikes. Meanwhile, down south, you have Athens, complacent, comfortable Athens. They completely ignored this growing local threat. They were agonizingly slow to mobilize, and they basically just refused to see that Philip's real ambition was to become the absolute ruler of all Greece. But Demosthenes, he saw exactly what was coming. He desperately tried to sound the alarm, practically begging his people to wake up and act. In his first Philippic in 351 BC, he hit them with this brutal reality check, saying, "Yet you, the Athenians, are sitting here as if you were on holiday." He was telling them, look, Philip is not dead, he hasn't gone home, and if we don't completely change the way we fight, we are going to be conquered. That first Philippic was just the beginning. It kicked off a relentless, decade-long campaign of speeches to rouse Athens. He delivered the Olympiacs, more Philippics, the speech on the embassy, and his absolute masterpiece, the speech on the crown. And you know, he did have some partial successes. The city actually did eventually mobilize against Philip. But tragically, Demosthenes' warnings were heeded far too late, and the response was just too small. Which brings us to the defeat at Chaeronea. Because ultimately, words, no matter how powerful, couldn't stop a well-oiled military machine. This tension boiled over into a catastrophic confrontation in central Greece that literally changed history. In 338 BC, Athens and Thebes finally team up against Philip at Chaeronea, and the Greek alliance is just utterly crushed. Fun fact, or maybe not so fun, Philip's son, an 18-year-old kid named Alexander, yes, that Alexander the Great, actually led the cavalry charge that broke the Greek lines. The political independence of the Greek city-states was basically over that day. But here's the tragic irony. Demosthenes himself was serving in the Athenian infantry line during this battle, and he panicked. He shamefully dropped his weapons and fled the battlefield.
As you can imagine, his political enemies mocked him mercilessly for this for the rest of his life. Though I should add, 2 years later, in 336 BC, when Philip was assassinated, Demosthenes was so thrilled he walked through the streets openly celebrating wearing a garland.
Now, fleeing a battle definitely exposed a pretty deep limitation in his character. The guy was clearly no natural military commander. But amazingly, despite that glaring flaw, he remained deeply respected back in Athens. They actually chose him to deliver the official funeral oration for the Athenian dead. And when Alexander the Great officially took over and immediately demanded that Athens hand Demosthenes over, the Athenians used some very careful diplomacy, flat out refused, and Demosthenes survived that initial terrifying threat. But then we hit a highly complex, seriously scandalous chapter in his late career. The big question: did the greatest orator in history take a massive bribe? This all traces back to the arrival of Harpalus. He was an embezzling friend of Alexander the Great, who decided to flee to Athens, bringing along enormous sums of stolen royal treasury money. Naturally, Demosthenes gets wrapped up in the drama. The precise details are still heavily debated by historians, but the core of it is that Demosthenes was formally accused of accepting a bribe from Harpalus. He was put on trial, convicted, and banished from his beloved Athens. Now, embracing the historical ambiguity here actually gives us a much more three-dimensional, relatable character. Demosthenes famously realized the brutal limits of his own legendary voice, admitting that he cannot fight money with words. As the ancient biographer Plutarch carefully notes, some sources clear him entirely, but the general historical verdict, his conviction was probably partly deserved, but also a massive political hit job.
And that sets the stage for our final act, the final defiance.
Banished, disgraced, aging. You'd really think this is where his story ends, right? Nope. Demosthenes was fiercely patriotic, and this led to one ultimate final act of defiance against Macedonian rule. Even while in exile, the guy worked tirelessly. He traveled from city to city, constantly trying to drum up opposition. Then, in 323 BC, shockwaves hit the ancient world. Alexander the Great dies. The Greek cities immediately rise up in what we call the Lamian War. And Demosthenes is joyfully called back to Athens by sheer public acclamation to help lead the resistance. But this brief glimmer of hope shattered almost instantly. The Greeks lost the Lamian War. The victorious Macedonian general Antipater imposed a brutally harsh settlement that explicitly demanded the immediate execution of all anti-Macedonian leaders. Demosthenes was forced to run from Athens one last time. He fled to the island of Caleria and took refuge in the sanctuary of the Temple of Poseidon. But there was just no escaping the reach of the new Macedonian regime. A ruthless Macedonian agent named Archias tracked him down. Archias stood outside the temple trying to coax the old orator out, making all these sweet promises of safe conduct if he'd just surrender. But Demosthenes was no fool. He knew exactly what awaited him if he stepped outside. In a deeply vivid, almost cinematic moment, he asked the agent for just a brief moment to write a final letter to his family. He retired alone deeper into the temple to write, and there, in total solitude, he began to suck on a hidden poison, a poison he had ingeniously concealed right inside the quill of his pen. After a little while, the agent outside starts getting impatient. He starts mocking Demosthenes, calling him a coward, telling him to come out. So Demosthenes stands up, poison coursing through his veins, and walks to the temple door. Referencing the mythical tyrant Creon, who notoriously refused to bury his enemies, he delivers this absolutely incredible theatrical final quote. He looks at Archias and says, "You may now act the part of Creon in the tragedy if you like, and cast forth this body of mine unburied. Antipater and his Macedonians have not so much as left thy temple unpolluted." Uttering those final defiant words, he collapsed and died right there at the foot of the altar. He was 62 years old. When it came down to it, he chose the severe, absolute integrity of poison in a sacred temple over the total humiliation of surrendering to a tyrant. So, we wrap up this explainer with a thought that really sticks with you. Demosthenes lost the war, and he lost his life, but his words outlived the very empire he fought against. So, what actually makes a true victory? Sure, he was deeply flawed. He panicked and fled a battlefield. He might have even caved to the temptation of a bribe. But he was also a man of unyielding, obsessive self-construction, who taught himself how to speak, literally syllable by syllable. He's the ultimate historical underdog. He made his speeches matter so much that here we are, analyzing them and learning from them over 2 millennia later. Thanks for exploring this amazing life with me.